Good morning, everyone. I am Hussein Ahmed, CEO of Dubai South Logistics District. It gives me a great pleasure to be with you today for the first episode of our Enabling E-commerce podcast series by EZDubai, which we are launching in response to the rapid growth of the e-commerce sector. In each episode, we will host an expert from the industry to discuss a topic related to different aspects of e-commerce sector. So we hope you will enjoy this series and find it insightful. I would like to welcome today our first guest in this series, Mr. Hussein Doughan, who is the General Manager of Euromonitor International in Dubai. We are delighted to have you on board, Hussein, and we couldn't think of anyone better to set the tone for the series, as I think every conversation starts with the data, and being at the helm of Euromonitor, your knowledge makes you the perfect fit. So I may get started straight by asking you to introduce to our audience and the recent report that was launched and the objective on what we have decided to doing it. Please, Hussein.
Good morning, Mohsen. First of all, thank you for having Euromonitor International to help kickstart this great series of podcasts and help discuss the exciting world of e-commerce. And it's an honor for me to be on with you today. There's a saying that goes, there's no research without action and no action without research. So in very simple terms, informed decisions based on research and reliance of data goes hand in hand with e-commerce operations. Super important. And whether you're in startup phase, whether you're looking at your logistical operations or analyzing consumer habits, that reliance on data in e-commerce is ultra important. You've asked me to introduce the report. So EZDubai, the e-commerce zone at Dubai South, had approached Euromonitor with a quest of really understanding the e-commerce sector across the UAE, but also the full picture around the MENA region. The report that we've put together is part of a series of reports where we look at key opportunities in the sector itself. To be specific, the report touches upon industry trends around e-commerce. It looks at growth drivers, but also the outlook in the future, what's to come next. And at Euromonitor, we're quite positioned to do this kind of research. We have research operations in 100 markets around the world where we focus on consumer industries and specifically e-commerce. And we're delighted to be part of this process today, where hopefully with this report, with the series of podcasts that EZDubai is putting together, you'll be driving thought leadership within the industry.
Thank you, Hussein. Obviously, e-commerce has seen a sort of it's been on the spotlight for some times, and particularly more so during the sort of the pandemic, especially in the last 2 years. What kind of potential do you see to continue on? What sort of potential do we continue to see in the e-commerce sector?
Well, the pandemic, by no doubt, it really changed consumer habits, and it changed them forever. And it's created huge opportunities for us right now. And it's really hard to have a discussion these days without using the word COVID or pandemic. However, we've got to, because it's a real driver and what's really changed in the story. The pandemic really accelerated your use of online selling platforms. It changed consumer demand over the last 2 years. And also it created that wider acceptance and reliance on online payments like we've never seen before, which is a huge change in terms of the landscape. If I was to kind of put some numbers to this and how, from a research point of view, how things transcribed, we're talking almost 15% growth in e-commerce spend across the MENA region. That's huge. And we're talking almost $32 billion in terms of spend on e-commerce. Now, while we talk about this big shift, did it happen across all the countries in the MENA region at the same extent? Not really. We've got to really break it down also to see where the opportunities lay. But over the last 2 years, we can see countries such as the UAE or Saudi Arabia really dominating in terms of that spend on e-commerce. They make up, combined together, over 70% of that whole e-commerce ecosystem spend. And of course, while we talk about the changes, other countries in the region that have really accelerated and spent and changed the spending in e-commerce are countries like Egypt and Qatar. While they come from a lower base, still huge growth that we've seen over the last 2 years across these countries as well.
Well, yeah, I think that's. I mean, we're seeing very healthy growth. I mean, you mentioned 15% growth in the e-commerce in the region. And where do you see this growth as do you see this as a permanent or as the trend or is something that was just hyped up during the pandemic?
Well, the change is permanent, and it's here to stay. And the pandemic really accelerated that shift in whether consumer buying habits, that comfort of using technology, and in some cases they were forced to rely on e-commerce and online payments, and it created new experiences. And we've got habits that are going to stick. Of course, we're getting post-pandemic now. Some habits may go back to normal, but we see strong permanence in terms of the change in that consumer habit. Now, if I was to really summarize it, we've seen historic and dramatic shifts in consumer behavior, and that's big. And so we've almost seen history in the making in the last couple of years in front of us. Now, there are drivers when we talk about these shifts and these permanent shifts that are somehow driving that growth and the change. And if we kind of wanted to summarize them across the Middle East region, I'd probably segment them into 3 main drivers that are really pushing that shift and what's driving it. The first one I'd say is that rising use of social media. We've got such a young population across our region. Consumers are connecting with brands. The social platforms are making it easy for brands now to connect, and they're promoting platforms to allow brands to start connecting with their consumers. So what that's created, stronger follower base online, it's created connection to products. And what you see is a rising trend, which is also very particular to our region, is that consumers here are not just relying on your traditional online reviews, they're relying on reading comments, they're relying on following brands and actually testing and looking at consumer sentiment and reviews through online channels. So social is one of the main aspects that's driving it, and very particular to the Middle East. And I will get into a few statistics later in our conversation around that point specifically. The second area that's helping drive that growth here and shaping it is the concept of omni-channels. What does that mean? When we talk about omni-channel, it's really connecting and selling products through different variety channels, whether it's through your direct e-commerce and last mile delivery and focusing on technologies around that. We've seen a lot of concepts around click and connect around the city. You can see a lot of the yellow boxes popping up across the city, and a lot of retailers adopting that as well. And as well as the main driver that's driving as well is consumers are now used to speed and convenience. They've enjoyed the process of having the convenience of ordering products to home and the speed behind it. And we've got an amazing infrastructure in the country that's allowed that. And the third, at least growth trend that's been pushing that change as well, we believe, is payment methods. There's huge comfort and acceleration in consumers in using online payment methods. And I will put up a statistic here. If I want to look at the UAE specifically, we're talking about 75% usage of plastic or cards online. And that's not a small number. If I want to put that number into perspective, globally, we're talking about a 55% global average when it comes to card spending online. UAE, we're talking about 75%. That's a huge milestone. And that really helps in accelerating your delivery. It really helps accelerating as well online purchases, and just creates the infrastructure to be able to spend online. So these are really the 3 trends that we're looking at: social, omni-channels, and payment methods that are accelerating the growth.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you well put in sort of categorizing these into sort of that 3 channels. And you know, over time with e-commerce, since probably exceptions of sort of mid-90s till now, it has particularly changed. I mean, given that sort of the growth we have and the way you've put it, sort of things that are sort of allowing the e-commerce to grow. I mean, what particular sectors do you see, you know, where the growth is? Any in particular sector that where you foresee there's an opportunity for people, or do you see where people should expect the growth in both in maybe in the UAE or in the region?
That's a good question. I'll break it down into probably 2 areas. I'll start with what a lot of companies want to know: where is that big opportunity and what are the big products selling online? If I was to start with that, the first obvious sector across MENA is consumer electronics. that remains to be one of the key dominating industry by no doubt across during the pandemic and even before the pandemic. So that is one of the strongest, fastest growing sectors where we see huge potential, and it's still ongoing. In terms of other sectors that we see also up and coming, you've got your apparel and footwear. That's also accelerated big time. You've seen during the last 2 years the shift of a lot of physical stores focusing on the online presence, focusing on delivering their product and making the product selections available online. And that happened at a very fast pace. For us, from a research point of view, we were super intrigued watching this because all of a sudden and at record times, you've seen IT projects being accelerated, investment being accelerated at creating selling platforms and moving physical SKUs to online digital shelves. And that happened at an unprecedented rate. So you've seen huge focus from your brick and mortar moving to online, which is around apparel and footwear. But also we've seen another segment come from a low base and just explode during the last period, which is food and drink. You've seen a lot of the food and drink delivery companies popping up, linking restaurants, linking grocery, and that has created intense competition, very intense sector when it comes to competition, but also we see it growing at a very fast pace over the last 2 years. Now, these are the obvious sectors of where we see the growth. Now, if I was to break down your question into where is the general growth happening or how do we see growth panning out across the region? If I was to start with MENA, over the next 5 years at least, we're talking about double-digit growth. If I was to put a number to that on a compounded basis, we're talking almost 12% compounded growth per year happening over the next 5 years. And that's really supported by your favorable policies, changing consumer sentiments, and appetite for more investment in the sector. And the e-commerce landscape or spending across MENA, we expect it to hit 50 billion. If you recall earlier in the conversation, I spoke about that 32 billion figure, currently where we are now. And we're expecting to move by 2025 to almost 50 billion US dollars of spend. And that's not small, that's a huge jump in growth. And if I want to look at the UAE, and without confusing our audience today with too many numbers, we're also talking about double-digit growth and coming from a strong base. And we can see it in the UAE focused on your food and drinks, consumer health, and electronics driving that growth. So the big opportunity is in our region. We see huge potential, but we also see an angle which needs to be tapped and a huge opportunity, which is also bringing your physical stores into the equation, into the whole omni-channel. And that's a huge opportunity that will also help accelerate the growth across the region.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think we've seen good growth over the region, and particularly food. I think during the pandemic did play a major role to put food on the table of the people. I think, I mean, with any growth that we see and with sort of opportunities that we witness, of course, the question becomes is sort of what are the challenges, biggest challenges that this industry face with sort of such growth that we see.
We get asked that question a lot, and you can get into so many different areas. So perhaps to help answer this question, I'll keep it in the context of product availability, supply chain, to keep it as relevant as possible. But we can't really talk about setting up and having the e-commerce industry successful without your proper regulation, without having the right ecosystem to support it. Without that infrastructure, you're not really going to have an environment that's helping accelerate or spur that growth that we want. So that remains to be a challenge. Now, the UAE is miles ahead. EZDubai is your biggest example. However, we've got a lot of work to do across the MENA region to help accelerate that regulation and infrastructure around e-commerce companies. Winning trust of your online consumers is also a challenge. The pandemic helped change that, but that still remains to be a challenge. And also targeting your consumers. Targeting consumers these days is not as easy as how it was 10 years ago. You rely on your biggest search engines and you go after them. Now you've got many channels. You've got your social, your engines, your video platform. So targeting consumers is also one where is a challenge and requires careful consideration. around investment, and also not leaving money on the table, which is converting your clients. You may be very good at attracting clients or online shoppers to your website, but you really have to also focus on that conversion, your abandoned carts. That remains to be also one of the biggest challenges, which is helping with that experience to win the consumers over. And of course, the consumer trust, that sentiment, the reviews. We spoke about the reliance on social. So companies in the region have the challenge of they've also got to maintain and listen to what customers and consumers are saying about their brands, what the comments are on different social platforms, be it on social media, be it in groups, be it in private groups, there's and forums. There's a lot of conversations. It's very important to pick these up. And of course, some of the logistical challenges is that also the right mix of payments and that flexibility. We've seen in our part of the world, you've got online payments, huge in the UAE, but in other parts of the region, there's still that reliance also on cash. So that forms part of that challenge as well. And we all know that cash results in a lot of failed deliveries as well, where there's the expectation of the consumer paying upon delivery, whether there's a no-show, whether the consumer is unreachable. And that last mile for us in the region is a bit of a challenge because we don't work, say, with your typical zip code addresses that lead you right to the doorstep. We work with door-to-door courier services at that last mile. And we know that's ultra challenging. And you've got your failed deliveries, whether it's on payment, whether consumer doesn't show up, or you've got to really hand that product physically over to, or the good physically to that consumer. So that's really a major challenge here. And of course, last but not least, it's that speed and delivery. Consumers right now are expecting speed. They've seen what things can look like online, and they want more, faster. And companies are competing and making commitments on same-day deliveries, and they're putting a lot of stress on the hardest and most expensive part of the whole infrastructure, which is that last mile delivery. So that's a huge challenge for companies to tackle. And some are starting to do it in-house, some are outsourcing. So huge debates around that.
Thanks, Hussein. I think one of the sort of the story we have is when we started sort of the EZDubai, we launched it back in sort of January 2019, pre-pandemic, and then we were successful also to co-lead a project at Dubai level to change to create sort of the e-commerce strategy, and that was September 2019. Is it a coincidence? Is it a sheer good luck? But I looked at it's the hard work of the team that worked since 2016 to ensure that this EZDubai was there. So I guess maybe it's sometimes being the right place at the right time does help. I mean, also I think one of the good things you mentioned about the consumer expectations, and sort of I mean, they are the most important things. I mean, in this business. I mean, how do you see? What are your thoughts about these consumers? I mean, I know you covered some part of it, and are they sort of informed? Are you know what's the sort of the behavior trend that we're going to be seeing with these consumers, considering sort of the growth and the sort of the expectation they're looking for?
Well, no doubt, your consumer in this part of the world is a young demographic, and we've got to keep that in mind when we think about them. They compare, they're informed, high usage of social media, and they rely not just on, like we said earlier, on your typical reviews, but they actually scan and do their research in social platforms before buying a lot of times and connecting with brands. Winning their trust is not easy, and we can see that. And also throughout Euromonitor's consumer lifestyle surveys, and we keep on picking this up, which is consumers in this part of the world are very experiential. They rely on experiences. They want tailored, customized, unique, and high standard of experience when it comes to shopping. And we've seen it through our physical stores, and this also is expected to translate over to the online world. So the other bit consumers are also looking at is that quick delivery, the convenience, and also purchase protections, the assurance that using cards, using online payments are also secure. And we've had a lot of progress over the last years. And with consumers these days, it's hard to build loyalty, especially with availability and competition and availability of lots of brands and resellers. So that requires careful targeting and also messaging and consideration. Now, I touched upon a point earlier where consumers in our part of the world, they rely a lot on connecting and following their brands. And that's a result of your younger consumer who's very connected, high access to smartphones, and they're actually interacting and following and reading up about their brands way before they purchase. And there's that strong affiliation and connection way in advance. And if I was to put a statistic to this, if we think about throughout our latest lifestyle, again, consumer survey that we've done, we see that 73% of UAE residents are on Facebook. Okay, and 68% of them use Facebook to actually get information about products that they're looking at. By Facebook, I mean Meta and their products.
Yeah.
In simple words, your consumers are more informed now, but also they're less cautious. So they're willing to take risks and try things and buy things online from different also sellers. So, and of course, they're becoming demanding. They're demanding for that speed, that convenience, and with that higher expectation for a really good experience and customer service throughout.
Yeah, definitely. I think within the e-commerce, consumers is definitely sort of the main focus, and we've seen sort of Jeff Bezos mentioned that in many of his interviews how consumers is the main focus, and then sort of the rest of it has to follow in that aspect of it. I mean, I know we talked a lot about the sort of the growth and how the behavior. I mean, and I'm sure with sort of this growth and people seeing the opportunities, we would probably see more players coming into the market. And what this brings me to the questions: what would you say are the key capabilities to build a successful sort of e-commerce business? If people who have already started or people want to come sort of start doing the e-commerce business.
Right. The first thing is technology. When we're talking about e-commerce, it's having that seamless shopping experience. Our consumers, like we said, are very experiential. They're expecting seamless, great experience online. So that is a very important aspect on the show front of the resellers online. Now, what's very important in terms of capability is to have your strong capability in ensuring that there is good product range and management of what we like to call of that physical and digital shelf at Euromonitor, which is very, very important. And that's also a big challenge to ensure that the availability and selection of product is available. But at the same time, we have to think of the operational side. So we're talking here about, earlier we're talking about the online stores, but you have to talk about what happens in the back end, which is your integrated supply chains. That requires huge investment. That requires the right infrastructure for it to be successful and to have strong capabilities. Some companies build those in-house, some outsource, but you have to have that right ecosystem, which is an example of what EZDubai is providing to its clients. Storage is very important. Your fulfillment centers and how these are organized are very important. Also having the right delivery infrastructure that moves the product out to the consumer. And of course, with agility and speed. So these are key capabilities that need to be built. But at the same time, we can't talk about e-commerce without talking about strong capability also around data, around analyzing data across all stages of the supply chain, from your manufacturing to your storage, to your fulfillment, all the way to delivery of the consumer, but also after what happens and targeting consumers. So having that strong capability around analyzing data and taking corrective measures and changes and actions around strategy is very important. And of course, it's also making sure that you have the right distribution channels and right partners working with you, whether you're doing things in-house, whether you're outsourcing. We all know that last mile delivery is the most expensive and difficult part of that process as well. And it makes or breaks the customer experience. So it's having strong capability around these to win the consumers over as well. And expertise in targeting customers through different channels. We spoke about that earlier, where customers are on many different channels, and there has to be some also strong capability on how to target and how to find customers and bring customers to your online platform, and then eventually convert them.
No, it's I think one thing that you mentioned is interesting is the ecosystem. I mean, anytime you try to develop a sort of a new sector in the region or any country in particular, ecosystem plays a sort of a huge impact. I mean, you answered part of it. Where do you, is that something that you think it's a must for any city or a country if they want to develop a sort of the e-commerce in their country, that they have that ecosystem?
No doubt. First of all, to set up an e-commerce industry, you really need to have progressive regulation. You need to have progressive laws, but also you need to have almost what we want to call purpose-built ecosystem that will help enable, spur, accelerate growth. And we're not just talking about having real estate buildings. We're talking about having actual infrastructure that's going to be meaningful to the supply chain, which is, again, what we see EZDubai doing within its free zone. It's also having your streamlined operations when it comes to licensing, when it comes to ease of doing business, very important. Across the UAE, ease of doing business is quite high, but we've got some work to do across the MENA region as well on a wider level. And it's also having that right enabling infrastructure that will motivate whether international investors or local investment to come into the sector. And of course, when we talk about having the right ecosystem, we also have to be talking about being in a hub where you have connection to local, regional, and global shipping and delivery infrastructure with high speed. Without that, you're going to struggle with your e-commerce supply chain. And efficiencies is the name of the game here. It's really having that right ecosystem and operating the ecosystem that has the right infrastructure to move product, to store it, and to help with the fulfillment and last mile delivery. And of course, some of the prospects of having 100% ownership when setting up is really also a really big key, attractive, and USP for international investment to either come in, and of course for local investment. And the other part when it comes to the ecosystem or infrastructure, we can't talk about e-commerce without having strong connectivity and a strong ICT network as well. That's critical to the success of the industry.
It's I mean, if you look at sort of what happened in Dubai in particular during the pandemic, you mentioned about the 100% ownership, you sort of the internet of sort of rolling of the 5G across the city or the country. These things happen, and definitely they do play a major role in sort of I mean, I would love to continue this the discussion, and it's been quite enlightenment for myself, and I'm sure the audience have sort of some of the data and some of the information. But I'm sure I'm going to ask for more in terms of you've shared some numbers, and since we're talking about the data and all this, what do you see in the next 3 years? What are the sort of the key trends that you see in the next 3 years?
Okay, so in terms of trends, we see strong growth across the region. In terms, if I was to break it down across MENA, we're talking about a greater penetration when it comes to online commerce. So rather than throwing just a confusing number out there, we're going to see in the next 3 years almost 3 times higher penetration of e-commerce sales than what we've seen pre-pandemic. So that's a huge shift in that trend. And we're talking about double-digit growth across the UAE and wider MENA region. And we're also talking about really high growth across your food, your drinks, your consumer health, electronics are really going to accelerate and help boost the change. And of course, the permanent shifts that we've seen in consumer habits, in consumer spending, that sentiment towards online purchases is here to stay. And it's going to help really accelerate and continue to drive the growth going forward. So in very simple terms, we see huge growth, double digit, easily over 11% growth compounded over the coming years.
Okay, thank you. It looks like very quite healthy. And my last question, I mean, what's the sort of, I would like, for the audience, what's the takeaway of all this sort of the data that we have shared? Where do you see it? I mean, what's your takeaway and what's your thoughts as a sort of an industry?
We spoke about a lot, so let me try to break it down into what's probably the most meaningful for our audience here. If I was to break it down, I'd probably focus on your infrastructure. I'd focus on operations and consumers. So these, I think, would be the 3 areas that really need focus when it comes to e-commerce. Infrastructure, we spoke a lot about it. It's being in the right environment, in the right purpose-built ecosystem that will help your business, that will help you get started and not to waste time on trying to figure out and create all the experience in-house. And hopefully that would enable growth. When we talk about infrastructure, access to omni-channels, figuring out how to connect with the consumer, not just through last mile delivery, but having ways for them to collect, click and collect, or having ways for them to visit your stores and also get your products. That's in terms of infrastructure. In terms of operation, the hidden work in the background, it's having your proper supply chains. It's having the right technology in place to drive efficiencies. Without it, it's very competitive out there. And e-commerce companies really need to think about data and how to leverage it. And that's super important when it comes to making the right decisions around improvement, around efficiencies, and connecting and bringing products to consumers in an efficient way. But of course, making the product, ensuring that the product is being fulfilled in the background, stored, supplied, and moved across that supply chain effectively when it comes to operations. And the last one is your consumer. Consumers here are ready for online purchases. They are very connected. They have had changes in habits. We've seen it. And they're ready for that shift. They're willing to spend more online. They're super connected with their brands. And it's a huge opportunity for companies to ensure that they strengthen their products and connect more and more with consumers. And we've got a huge opportunity for growth. So really, I'd say your infrastructure, operations, consumers, and the focus on these three areas are super important when it comes to the growth and acceleration of the sector.
Thank you, Hussein. I think I'm afraid we're running out of time for this sort of podcast series. But certainly we've got Hussein Doughan, General Manager of Euromonitor International at Dubai. And I think the conversation always goes by the sort of the basic description of supply chain is to having the right product at the right place at the right time. And I think with e-commerce, the challenge becomes at the right price. So thank you very much. And we look forward to sort of our future podcast. And we look forward to seeing everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohsen, and thank you for having us with you today on the first series of these podcasts. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah.